The Young and the Restless spoilers, full episodes Thurdays update the 4th of September 2025. Jack had not planned the encounter so much as he had curated it, arranging the evening with the same meticulous care he reserved for product launches and hostile board meetings. The Genoa City Athletic Club was full enough to provide camouflage, but not so crowded that details would be lost, the lighting warm and flattering. The acoustics just sharp enough that a wavering voice could not hide its tremor. Diane arrived beside him at the bar, a study in composed vigilance, and when Phyllis swept into bright to buoyant, a woman auditioning for nonchalant Cedian spotted her first. Jack caught the movement in Diane's posture, then turned, lifted a hand, and gave a genial wave that could have meant 100 harmless things. Diane, who knew better than anyone that Jack's charm was a scalpel when he needed it to be, asked under her breath what he thought he was doing, and he told her without telling her, "Follow my lead." Phyllis crossed to them with a confidence that came in slightly ahead of her, and for a few deceptively smooth minutes, everyone played their assigned roles. She mentioned, almost casually, what a revelation it had been to work with Kane Ashby, how nimble, how visionary. How the partnership had clarified opportunities that Javits' bureaucracy could not pivot toward fast enough. Jack listened like a man collecting seashells, smiling, nodding, then he dropped the single pebble that cracked the glass. He had heard Kane had changed his mind about something materialtimans. Scope, perhaps the spine of the whole venture. The story froze in Phyllis's eyes for one breath too long. It was only an instant, a hiccup in the ocean current. But in that instant, Jack saw the lie assemble itself. Watched the body language reverse course. Watched the tearful narrative parachute back into place with a brittle perfection that rang false to anyone who had been married to or at war with Phyllis Summers. "Everything's fine," she said without quite saying it, which is how people always say it when everything isn't fine. Diane marked the shift, filing it away, not because she needed more reasons to doubt Phyllis, but because precision mattered. Because when you were defending a family company that had survived devastations both market-made and personal, you did not let inconsistencies float to the ceiling. You pinned them down and named them. Then Amanda Sinclair arrived at the edge of the table, the cool weather front of the law moving into a room heated by too many old grievances. Jack didn't whirl on her so much as redirect the conversation with a single curt observation about boundaries that had been crossed and assurances that had evaporated. He left the two women together with a polite retreat that read like a reprimand, because Jack had already decided the most effective move he could make tonight was to stop making moves at all. Phyllis pivoted toward Amanda the second he was gone, and the temperature changed again. She didn't bother with pleasantries she rarely did when adrenaline was steering the wheel. "The target is not me," she told Amanda in the inadorned language of strategy. "The target is Kane, and if Jack is circling him, then I need to know what's on the water that's attracting the sharks." Amanda gave the answer good lawyers give when they don't intend to answer. There is nothing to tell. It was textbook sound, technically correct, and all wrong for the reality of Genoa City, where nothing was ever nothing, least of all silence. Phyllis called it as she saw it, the disbelief closing over her features with the finality of a door. "You're lying to me." It didn't explode into a scene. Both women were too practiced for that. But what passed between them had the pressure and consequence of an argument shouted across a courtroom. And Amanda's composure impressive as always could not dilute the sense that the room had become a chessboard dense with invisible pieces. This was bigger than a boutique partnership and smarter than a straightforward raid on Jabot market share. It smelled like a multi-layered play built to move through intermediaries and cutouts, a cascade that would leave no fingerprints on the mastermind and every stain on the hired help. The whisper that had reached Jack's ear, the rumor attaching itself to Kane's project like a burr, was that an algorithm? Call it what it was, a powerful AI framework set somewhere inside the architecture of Kane's latest venture. A system sophisticated enough to map supply chain fragilities in competitors and model regulatory sentiment in real time. To generate a parade of plausible deniability while it nudged outcomes in one direction again and again. Phyllis had worked in enough backrooms to know the difference between breathless hype and an instrument calibrated to change the direction of wind. This felt like the latter. Yet when confronted with the idea, Amanda's denials had the granular specificity that suggested she believed them, and that bothered Phyllis most of all. Because if Amanda had been kept out of that loop, then someone was gaming the board at an altitude where legal counsel existed to sign off on the visible paperwork, while the real work happened 3 floors below ground. And if Kane truly didn't have accesses, the whispers also insisted he had sworn, hand over hearth, and either someone else on his team was driving the secret engine, or the entire AI was a ghost story deployed to make everyone look in the wrong direction while a more human, more old-fashioned con clicked forward in plain sight. Phyllis's instincts divided into and ran different routes at once. One wanted to protect the tailwinds she'd built with Kane, to believe he had evolved past the brash shortcuts that had thrown grenades into his life before. The other wanted to gut the story, to pull it apart fiber by fiber until whatever and whoever was hiding inside had to show its face. She could also feel, even through the glitter of the bar and the slow drift of waiters ferrying drinks, that Jack and Diane were not the only observers tonight. Genoa City was a small town disguised as a large one. Word traveled through its arteries faster than a market alert, and power had a way of appearing as if by accident wherever pressure was being applied. She didn't have to turn to know more than one phone had already lit up with tidbits from this room, phrases trimmed of context, the kind of gossip that grew thorns as it passed from hand to hand. When she excused herself and left the club, it was not a retreat but a redeployment. She had questions that would never be answered at a table under chandeliers. The answers, insofar as anyone in this town ever answered anything, will be at the source, and the source was not Amanda Sinclair. The source tonight was a ranch outside the city where a man who never needed algorithms to predict outcomes was setting the next piece in motion. The driver who ferried Kane Ashby down the long private road had the politeness of men who understood the ecosystem they worked inside. The Newman Ranch had the silence that comes from money old enough to be bored by its own legend. Kane had walked into plenty of rooms where he was not sure of the temperature, but he had rarely entered one so completely aware that his hands were about to be placed on a scale he could not see. Victor Newman did not rise when Kane arrived. He did not need to. The mustache had a way of communicating, in the tilt of a shoulder or the distance he allowed between himself and a guest, that a meeting's variables had already been solved. The polite euphemisms fell away quickly. Kane stated, with the measured clarity of a man who had rehearsed the line until it no longer needed rehearsing, that he would not participate in any operation designed to destabilize the Abbotts or Jabot. He talked about his family because it was the only anchor he trusted not to be yanked from the seeped-about children who needed steadiness. About a life that could not absorb another round of collateral damage. He said it without contempt, without flattery, and without the performative indignation men often drag with them when they turn down power. And still he knew even as he spoke that Victor was not cataloging his words so much as measuring the load-bearing beams behind them. Victor nodded once, the gesture of a patriarch hearing his son declare he was done with war. He understood, he said, because understanding was a currency he extended the way central banks extend liquidity, strategically and without ever losing. Then he revised pretense entire. This isn't an invitation. It's a directive. The sentence did not need an exclamation point to crack like thunder. In the bare seconds that followed, Kane felt the room rearrange itself into the older, harsher logic of this town, where debts and histories and missteps formed a ledger nobody ever erased. Refuse if you want, the subtext went, but refusal does not close the ledger. It simply adds a line to it. Kane took his time before responding, not because he was cowed, but because he had sworn quietly and almost religiously not to let the first impulsive one that had broken so many things in his life write his answer for him. He said again that he wouldn't be a blunt instrument. He would not be the front man of anybody's crusade against the Abbotts, not Victor's and not anyone else's. If there were people using his name to launder their plays, then that was already a story he was going to end, not amplify. And no, he did not have access to some hidden, fire-breathing AI designed to pry open competitors like steel cans. The projects attached to his name were lean by design and audited by necessity. If anyone had smuggled a secret engine into his orbit, he wanted the serial number more than his detractors did. Victor listened, and the expression that crossed his face was not disbelief so much as interest sharpened into purpose. It suited Victor's view of the world, which was that people lied to him less often than they lied to themselves. Perhaps Kane believed every word, perhaps every word was true. Neither truth altered Victor's next move. He wasn't building a scheme that required Kane's permission. He was arranging leverage against Jabot, against those who would use Kane as a decoy, and perhaps, if it came to it, against Kane himself. The power of a directive is not in its volume, but in its inevitability. Victor stood only when he chose to end the conversation, and the conversation ended not with a threat, but with the more unnerving promise of follow-up. The car would take Kane wherever he needed to go. The road out felt longer than the road in, and for a mile, Kane didn't speak because he was performing a crime scene reconstruction of his own week. Where had the rumor been seated? Which meeting had felt off by a single degree? If someone had attached an illicit engine to his chassis, was it to speed him up or make him crash? His refusal at the ranch had been unequivocal, but refusals do not neutralize pressure. They redirect it. And pressure has a way of finding hairline fractures even in stone. Back in town, word of the ranch meeting compressed, distorted, already mutating through the usual arteries. Jack heard that Victor had summoned Kane. Phyllis heard that Kane had confessed nothing existed to confess. Diane, who did not believe in luck as a business model, assumed there would be an aftershock and began bracing Jabot's internal systems for impact. What had begun as a test at the club had evolved by nightfall into a three-front campaign. Protect the company from a hit no one could yet diagram. Pry open whatever Amanda had been told not to know, and force daylight onto Kane's project until rumor exhausted itself in the light. Jack ordered a quiet audit of unusual options activity around Jabot and its suppliers, preferring to catch the shadow rather than the hand that cast it. Diane convened a confidential engineering review of the proprietary processes most exposed to competitive mapping if an algorithm was out there modeling Jabot's vulnerabilities. She wanted to rewrite the variables before the model finished its run. Phyllis, meanwhile, followed the scent in the way she always had, not through the front door, not with affidavits and subpoenas, but through the human cracks assistants underpaid for the secrets they held, vendors who heard more than they realized. A scout of old emails that never say what they mean but often mean more than they say. She turned her attention to the phrasing in the rumor itself, the stubborn specificity that clung to the word's access to a powerful AI. People who have the thing rarely call it by its headline. People who want you to look for the thing make sure it has a headline. So which was it? A genuine covert system built to guide a slow-motion destabilization of Jabot's supply ecosystem, or a paper tiger engineered by someone who understood how the mere fear of an invisible engine could cause a company to overcorrect, to lock down, to spook its own partners, and trip itself. If that someone wanted to hurt the Abbotts without lifting a finger, there were worse strategies than forcing them to build an expensive moat around a rumor. She could see, as if the blueprint had been left on the table and no one had thought she would read it, how either option advantaged a silent third party. And in one of those bleakly honest flashes that make Phyllis both dangerous and indispensable, she conceded the possibility that she herself be working with Kane by defending him vigorously. By needling Jack and Amanda had become a piece on the board that an unseen player was moving with deft little taps. But self-awareness was not self-erasure. She would not step off the board. She would become harder to move. By midnight, the club had emptied and the city's surface innocence had settled back into place, but the undercurrents ran faster, tugging at the ankles of the people who pretended not to feel the pull. Victor, somewhere in the dark margins of the ranch, made one phone call and then another, seeding outcomes the way farmers seed entire seasons with a gesture that looks small only from a distance. He had not needed Kane's agreement because obedient pieces are less valuable in the long run than predictable ones. And after tonight, Victor knew at least one thing about Kane. The man would not be baited into a role that aligned with everybody's worst memories of him. That made him harder to weaponize and more interesting to watch. Jack locked his office and allowed himself a few seconds to imagine the relief of being wrong that there was no engine, no staged cascade, no shadow campaign. The relief lasted less than a breath. Diane stood in the doorway, and without words they exchanged the consensus that had kept them alive through uglier storms. Assume the threat is real until it has been proven fictional twice. Phyllis, back in her own corner of town, stared at a name she had circled in her notes 3 times. The name was not Kane's and not Amanda's. It was a technician attached to an outside contractor with a history of working one layer removed from projects that later became scandals. That was where she would begin at dawn, not by confronting, not by broadcasting, but by following the money that paid for the code that did not exist. And Kane, who had driven in silence until the city lights rose around him like a confessional, texted a single message to the one person who had always told him the truth even when it shattered the tableware. Someone is trying to hang a crime I didn't commit on a system I don't even possess. If I am the decoy, find the hunter. For a town that loves its melodramas, the day had been unusually quiet on the Surf Aseno arrests. No public fallings out, no boardroom coups. But soap operas are not made of explosions so much as fuses, and Genoa City had collected enough fuses in 24 hours to wire a skyscraper. Victor had issued a directive masquerading as advice. Kane had refused a role written for a version of himself he no longer intended to play. Phyllis had confronted a lawyer whose very competence made her obstruction feel clean. Jack and Diane had interrogated a story and found too many fingerprints where there should have been none. And somewhere in the echo chamber of rumor and intention, someone who had counted on predictable reactions began recalculating. Because nothing unsettles a choreographer more than dancers who miss the cue on purpose. Whether the engine existed or not, whether Kane had ever been granted access or had simply been painted with its aura, the strategic outcome converged on the same point. The Abbotts would strengthen their walls, Newman would test its levers, and Phyllis would do what Phyllis always did when the spectacle threatened to swallow the signal. She would disappear from the spotlight just long enough to touch the wire that everyone else was stepping over. The lie at the bar, the denial at the ranch, the accusation in a lawyer's measured voice known of it was the main event. It was prelude, it was casing. It was the low murmur in a theater just before the lights go down and the real play begins. Victor's summons had the weight of a verdict long before Kane crossed the threshold of the ranch, and the old world quiet of the place Phyllis would measured light. A stillness that could muffle the sound of a conscience turningly amplified the sense that this was not a meeting but an arraignment conducted without a bench. Kane had rehearsed his refusal a dozen ways on the drive over, burnishing it until it contained neither apology nor defiance. Only the steadiness of a man who understood that saying no to a storm did not stop the rain, but at least kept his hands on his own umbrella. He offered that refusal as carefully as a treaty. He would not take part in any operation to gut Jabot or to harm the Abbotts by proxy. He would not be a cudgel wielded to settle old scores under the guise of innovation. He would not mortgage his children's peace for short-term victories masquerading as destiny. The words felt clean in his mouth, grounded in lessons he had earned the expensive way, but Victor's response washed through them like an incoming tide. The patriarch did not raise his voice or pound the desk. He did not need to. He allowed the air to cool a degree, and then he named the pressure points with clinical precision, starting not with the supposed scheme, but with the cost of refusal. Newman Media, a name that to outsiders meant glossy features and starched interviews, meant something different to the people who had lived long enough in Genoa City to watch narratives be manufactured and reputations be repurposed. Victor, with that uniquely dispassionate calm that made even a compliment sound like leverage, indicated that the story of Kane's fortune had the rough edges, the leaps that had seemed charmed. The string of deals whose timing had always been a little too fluent was a narrative that could be retold with different lighting. Not a threat, precisely, more like an actuarial table recited aloud. Everyone knew that every empire, personal or corporate, contained chapters that read like a blink when they should have read like a calendar. The choice before Kane, as Victor framed it, was whether he wanted that blink enlarged. And then, as if the prologue were complete and the real script could begin, Victor sketched his proposition with the efficiency of a man for whom propositions were just the visible capstones of strategies laid weeks earlier. He believed Kane and his team were sitting on a system called its software if one needed the comfort of small words that could infiltrate any company's public-facing nervous system, exhale itself into their data exhaust, and pull back a model of where to press until the structure listed and fell. He did not present it as rumor. He presented it as a known capacity, a thing proven in private even if denied in public, and he named its outcome without coyness. Used properly, this would end Jabot's reign as a viable competitor. Not in a dramatic raid, but in the elegant erosion of everything the Abbots relied upon to keep their footing. Kane's denial rose instantly, trained by both truth and necessity. There was no such software in his shop, no ghost engine running in a cellar, no clandestine model built to emulate another firm's pulse. He said, because he had to say and because he meant it, that tools of that magnitude belonged to the kind of work that made supply chains cleaner or healthcare safer or fraud harder to seed. Not to private wars whose trophies were board seats and bruised egos. He said that even if such capabilities were theoretically within reach for engineers with the right perversity married to the right genius, the choice to point them like a weapon on Jabot would stain everybody who touched the trigger. Victor listened as if he were untroubled by either morality or denial. Neither had ever moved markets as reliably as incentive. He answered with a conviction that did not need volume for emphasis that he did not merely suspect the technology's possibility, he knew. With the certainty of a man who had decades of practice recognizing the shapes of power before others learned their names, that Kane had the aptitude and the team to produce it. He did not argue the ethics, because he did not need to win that debate to win the war. He shifted the frame instead, asserting that Kane's best use of such a system present tense inevitable will be to deploy it not defensively, not in the philanthropic after hours that tech founders like to showcase in their press kits, but offensively, to finish a rivalry that had outlived its uses. Destroy Jabot, he insisted, strip it from Abbott hands once and for all. Exchange the exhausting stalemate of two dynasties trading blows for the clarity of a map ruled by a single flag. The words were not shouted. They did not need to be. They hung in the room with the authority of orders disguised as opportunities. Kane felt each layer of the proposition grinding against the life he had been trying to design since the last time a bad impulse had impersonated a good strategy and detonated his. Weak in the shape of a year. He knew what it would mean to be seen leaving the ranch at this hour. He knew what it would mean to be rumored to hold a skeleton key to any competitor's house. He knew, too, that whether or not he truly possessed the code Victor believed in, enough people would decide he did for the rumor to become a usable truth. He said again that he would not be that man. He had staff whose ambition could outpace their wisdom. Yes, and consultants who loved to pitch in verbs big enough to eclipse their nouns. But there was no hidden architecture designed to crawl another company's edges and tag it until the facade fell. If anyone had salted his orbit with something like it, he would find the source and cut the wire. He left the ranch not victorious and not defeated, exactly, but altered. Like a man who had been told the weather would be changing and knew he had exactly one day to reinforce the roof before the first guest. The threat to reframe his past for the cameras felt less like blackmail and more like a promise to edit the next chapter in real time. And the part of him that used to solve pressure by doubling down understood grudgingly, soberly that the world had caught up to the old trick and turned it radioactive. The path forward would require something duller and more difficult. Inventory, internal audit, disciplined distance from anyone who might enjoy surfing the chaos that would now pursue him. The chaos was already drafting other people into its choreography. At the Abbott estate rooms that had learned to hold grief, triumph, and cafeteria-level family politics with the same patience Sakal decided he would seize control of a narrative spiraling into guesswork by putting a ring around it. He had, in the abstract, always imagined proposing in a season of calm, with the kind of thoughtfulness that anticipated questions before they were born. But men do not always propose in seasons, they propose in moments, and the moment he had chosen was shaped by the argument earlier in the day, by the way Claire had withdrawn in that precise, not quite collapsing posture of someone protecting a heart that has not yet decided whether it is under attack. He took the impulse to fix and translated it into action the way abbots have always translated friction into design changes. He left one conversation with hurt edges and entered a jeweler's with a score to settle against uncertainty. The ring sat in his pocket like a talisman that would melt away every poorly chosen word when revealed under the right light. When he asked Claire what was wrong, he meant it as a gentle lead-in, a soft place for her to land before he showed her the plan he believed would eclipse the day's turbulence. What he met instead was the accuracy of a woman who had spent the last month learning how to recognize acceleration dressed as romance. She did not accuse him so much as hold up a mirror to the timing. The ring had been bought in the hours immediately after an argument. The dinner invitation had arrived as soon as she had asked for space. The proposal now had the anxious outline of a man trying to outrun a conversation by replacing it with a ceremony. She did not say he didn't love her. She did not doubt that love could be present and misguided in the same breath. What she doubted was the frame that suggested a vow could stand in for the slower work of rebuilding trust where it had been nicked by impatience. She asked when he had bought it, and when he told her earlier than today. But not as early as it would feel if the story were written to flatter their certaintish read the subtext accurately enough to make his chest tighten. Soon after the fight. Soon after the reminder that there are parts of her he cannot manage with a calendar. She reminded him that she had said she needed time, and time is not an ingredient that responds to heat. She catalogued the speed, a reconciliation dinner, a proposal, and the next steps she feared would be sketched in for her before she'd signed off on the headline. While she spoke about the specter of children being added to an agenda that did not yet have stable foundations, she was not rejecting the idea of a life with him. She was rejecting the logic that assumed love proves itself by forcing tomorrow to arrive today. Kyle heard the judgment inside her caution and did not entirely disagree with it. In a year where every pillar on which he had built his identity had taken a turn at wobbling, father who had always been a compass now juggling predators at the gates. The company that had been a birthright now an obligation prosecuting its right to exist. The city itself an amphitheater for rivalries that promised, and only when someone rewrote the rulish wanted one piece he could declare finished. The way a builder will crown a roof to remind a neighborhood that the house is real and can keep out the rain. He had chosen the ring not as a shortcut, but as a declaration of an axis around which the rest could be expected to spin more sanely. He told her all of that without the pleading that ruins many truths, and still her eyes held the same careful distance, the same insistence that intimacy is not a truce and a wedding is not a wand. She told him again, without contempt, that all he had done was confirm her suspicion that he would try to heal by accelerating, because acceleration is always easier than apology and waiting. The unbearable part was that she was not wrong. In the silent seconds after her words, he saw himself through her lens. The man who reaches for a solution that can be worn on a finger because the solution that must be lived in a room requires sitting in the discomfort he would rather outrun. He countered not by contradicting her, but by widening the aperture. He spoke about legacy, about the way his family's name had always been something to be defended in public even while it needed repair in private. About how he wanted their love to be the one arena in which he did not have to perform stability. He could build it. He admitted that buying the ring felt like action in a week full of reaction. He said he should have asked what she needed and then done that, even if what she needed was a couple of days without his voice in her ear. He did not promise not to make the mistake again. He promised to fight his own reflexes more effectively. She did not hand him an answer, because answers handed under duress are that never clear. She asked for the very thing he should have offered first, time to feel the truth of his words in the space where no one is being watched. She said something else, too. Not quite in those words, but with the unmistakable gravity of someone who has watched men love strategy more than they love outcomes. that she would not be the person he used to demonstrate to the city that an abbot could still plan and execute without error. She would not be a counter-programming decision scheduled to steal oxygen from whatever Newman or Jabot conflagration would hit the feeds tomorrow. She wanted to know whether he would still want to marry her if the next quarter ended in a quiet victory that no one outside the family ever noticed. When she placed the ring back into his palm carefully, not as a rejection of him, but as a reset of passé, he did not flinch. The small box closed with the softest sound, but the moment had the force of a course correction. The two seen a zone in a room where power had learned to pretend to be benevolence, one in a room where love had learned not to mimic a press release were not isolated secrets. They vibrated along the same wire that ran through Genoa City, a wire tuned to carry leverage faster than information. The whisper leaving the ranch was already morphing. Victor had finally found the key he needed to take Jabot apart. Kane had confirmed the existence of a program that would make corporate espionage look quaint. Newman Media would soon publish a surgical expose that would render every defense a confession. Or, in other versions, Kane had defied Victor's imperial temptation and left the ranch with the righteous fury of a man determined to alert the abbots to a storm they could not yet see. The whisper leaving the estate had its own trajectories. Kyle had proposed because the abbots were scrambling for optics. Claire had refused because she was still Newman at heart and would never anchor herself to a house about to share a new round of blows or the kinder reading. That to people were trying to learn how to grow a life in a city that turns every choice into a headline. Each version would be picked up by people who needed it to be true for their own plans to work. Jack would feel, in his bones, the asymmetry in the pressure. A patriarch attempting to weaponize innovation through rumor of a mythical system. A son trying to ground his life before the next corporate wave dragged him again into public. Diane would parse the tech claims and firm up the company's defensive posture not because she believed Kane had a ghost engine to aim at their weakest joints, but because you do. Not wait until after the first breach to install the second lock. Phyllis would continue to pick at the threads of the AI narrative, smelling in it both a real fear and a profoundly useful fiction. Convinced that the fastest way to implode a competitor is to force it to spend weeks protecting itself from the wrong threat, Amanda would maintain her trained calm, insist on what she knew and refuse to speculate beyond it, because speculation has a way of turning into a deposition transcript. And Victor, satisfied that he had introduced the right degree of destabilization with a handful of words, would let the city talk while he watched who leaned where was circled, who hardened, who sought allies, who overplayed. Kane, for his part, moved quickly in the only arena where speed was the kind of virtue Claire distrusted least. He convened a quiet review of every external dependency touching his work, isolating contractors whose credentials were immaculate, but whose histories had the strange habit of becoming tangled with small scandals a year after they'd left. He instructed his lead to vet their code for features no client had ever asked for, to examine abstractions that seemed designed to be repurposed, to check for scaffolding that could be pointed outward. He drafted a sealed statement of principles for his team, not a press release, not a sermon, just a document that made clear, in the sort of language people internalize when they know promotions and firings will follow it, that any system built to map a competitor's vulnerabilities would be treated as a betrayal of the brand he was trying to reclaim. It was part ethics, part early legal defense, part promise to himself that he would not let anyone use his name to sell something he would not buy. He toyed with the idea of a private conversation with Jack, the sort of quiet whose memory could be useful later if the ground shook, but he understood how even that act could be framed as collusion, as choreography, as an opening note in the very duet Victor hoped to score. So he waited and worked, a combination that had felt alien to him once but now read as survival. And somewhere between those two rooms, separated by a small city with a long memory, Claire stood by a window and tried to name the emotion that followed the fading adrenaline of saying no to a gesture every story had taught her to want. It felt like courage and it felt like loss, but mostly it felt like the difference between being a plot point in someone else's arc and being the narrator of her own. She loved Kyle and he loved her, And those facts did not become less true because she did not choose to be wife by sundown and mother by spring. She could imagine a life where it later would be a kind of vow rather than a delay tactic, where the ring would return not as an apology for speed but as a punctuation mark at the end of a conversation that had been allowed to finish itself. She could also imagine a life where the pressure of being an Abbott's choice would contort every room she walked into, where people would demand to know which family she belonged to whenever she tried to talk about jobs or art or weather. She was not naive enough to pretend that love with Kyle could ever be just two people. She was wise enough to require that it at least begin there before it took on the weight of their last names. She inhaled and exhaled and counted small rituals that look fragile until you realize they are the scaffolding upon which whole futures are built. Outside, the city was already inventing revisions. Inside, she allowed herself the rare luxury, in Genoa City, of believing that patience might be an act of power.